thank you everyone for coming along. I've moved on to this second slide just so you understand that for those that are talking, particularly since we're bureaucrats, administrators, that they're not necessarily the views of the department, they're the views that have come out of a collaborative process, using our consultants, using our esteemed panel members to the right, people who governed the project. I'll go into a little bit of background in a second around the nature of that project. The critical thing for this particular project is it came about through the National Partnership Agreement. So we get funding from the Commonwealth, we have to do certain things. There's about $50 million a year, roughly, goes into the National Partnership. And in particular, there's a few $1 million attached to our performance against this, which we put back into training. It's not specifically for the project, but it's a milestone that we have to meet. And it's to do with the external validation of RTO assessment practices. Now, critical thing in terms of where that reform came from, to cast your minds back in around 2011-12, the National Skills Council, the NSSC, kicked off on behalf of COAG, the ministers at the time, I think it was called Scotese, kicked off a particular reform agenda, consulted widely with the community industry, lots of feedback came into that process, and they came up with a report called the Case for Reform. And one of the items in the Case for Reform was around looking at assessment practices. And not just assessment practices, but also looking at actual training itself. Now, that's what sort of got into for our national partnerships. We've then moved on to do the particular work over the last 18 months to 2 years, but certainly over the last year it's really gone up a gear, being run by Stephanie Hirashi, with the support, of course, of our manager, Karen Purdy. Fantastic job, and of course our various steering committees. So if we go the clock back to about 2013, what we did is, in response to the National Reform Report issued by the NSSC, key focus was around training and assessment. What was driving it were employer views and industry views about just not being happy and not trusting the product. So our approach to that was to get the stakeholders in the tent. So we brought in some, I think from memory, some of the GTOs, but certainly we brought in the industry training councils and a few other players, including the regulator, local regulator. And the critical push was to make sure this wasn't a view of the department. It wasn't about having specific RTOs talk to this. It was about getting employers to the greatest extent, and in particular to start off industry, to really lead the way, to go, well, if you're indicating in public forums there's a problem, so you've really got to be part of the solution and driving where you want to take this. So we took the role in the department of being a facilitator, a coordinator of how we could bring the various players together and look at what issues were going to need to be fixed. Now, we had the forum. What happened is that everyone dived in and said, these are the types of issues that are a problem. In particular, they went after the TAE Cert 4 and assessment, and a couple of others, but they help us drill down on which qualifications we wanted to look at, what types of things we wanted to look at and how to go about it. We set up from there a governance framework and a basic approach as to how we'd run these pilot models. So the idea was, with the governance, we definitely wanted to have our peak bodies representing the RTOs. We thought that was right and proper, given it's the assessment training practices of RTOs. So we had Larry Davies from ACPET participate on that. We also had Keith Spence as part of the State Training Board, and very influential member, of course, in the VET system at that time, participate. And some others. I think we had Chamber of Commerce and Industry, obviously with wide representation to bring some of that industry and employer views to the table. Myself to chair and coordinate those particular players. And of course some administrative people. And TAFE Directors Australia, which was for WA represented by Neil Fernandez. And in that particular capacity, Dr. Derek Schwartz from Central Institute representing Neil on most occasions, given Neil's busy workload at the time. And I think Derek will be participating on the panel today, but just like to stress, I think Derek's actually doing that in a private capacity rather than representing Altea. Is that correct, Derek? Okay. Well, you take your pick. It's up to you. I just didn't want to leave you hanging. Now, that was to basically give strategic oversight for the project, but the core thing is from there, we then went down into specific industry areas. We did that. It was about getting then industry experience, some RTO, some employers, some training councils who own that particular training package and oversight over those qualifications, is to bring the specialists in to actually run the pilot itself. And then the higher level group, the strategic reference group, would then just sit over the results and kick it around and provide any guidance that we could. But really where the rubber hit the road were the project control groups, their appointment of an industry specialist, assessor, trainer background, audit background. But this was definitely not about being an audit. It's really about what learnings we could get about the practices we saw out there. I'll leave Steph now to Josh tapping a watch, so I've got to stop talking. But is to leave the validator out there in the field, not about an audit, and certainly getting the buy-in that we needed. This had no regulatory force. It's all about collaboration, it's all about education, but it's certainly not about big stick compliance. And I'll leave Steph to fill in the detail from here. Thanks, Steph.
Thank you, Russ. Just before I get started, I'd also like to thank all the RTOs that participated in the project, and I know there are representatives from quite a few of those RTOs here today in the audience, so thank you very much for being involved in the project. So to start out with, external validation, independent validation, we use those terms interchangeably, so apologies if I mix them up during this presentation. And we worked with the assumption that validation is an ongoing process of quality review and improvement. And I should just flag at the start here that we didn't quite close that loop in this project. We reviewed processes, gave advice to RTOs. We're not going to go back and revalidate to see what has been the result of that feedback. What we'll do is talk to RTOs and say, what will you do? What changes will you make? We started out with a fairly broadly defined idea of what we were going to do. Because it's a pilot project, it's a research project, we didn't want to start out with a very rigid definition. We thought, we'll have a broad idea, implement it once, get some lessons learned from that, change what we're doing for the next one, implement it 4 times in succession. So by the final one, we should have something pretty close to a workable model. But roughly the model was we had experts in training and assessment, the validators, working with experts from industry to look at RTO assessment documentation. So it was essentially a paper-based validation exercise for the most part. And the assessment documentation was reviewed against a set of quality features that the validators and industry had determined all RTOs should be doing these things all the time in order to have valid assessment in this industry. Then that sort of desktop research was supported by information from employer interviews, if required by the industry group, and also campus visits to talk to lecturers, if required by the industry group. I should point out, for example, in the TAE pilot, we didn't talk to employers because that wasn't requested. Also, I should flag, we didn't talk to students. That was highlighted as a possible limitation with this approach. And the end result of it all was constructive feedback to RTOs. So a report to RTOs tailored to them, saying, you're doing this well, keep it up, you're doing this perhaps not so well, here's how you might address that. So what did it actually look like step by step? So first of all, the validator and the industry steering group would get together and tailor that broad approach to the specific needs of that industry. So for example, in the TAE, the industry group identified that online assessment was perhaps a bit of an issue, so there were perhaps more questions targeting that in that validation. Whereas in the bricklaying and blocklaying pilot, that wasn't considered such an issue, so it wasn't such a focus. Also at this point, they would define which quality criteria we were looking at and choose the units of competency that were in scope to be looked at. Then the validator would go out and review the RTO documentation. This was sourced by the department. We invited all RTOs in the state delivering publicly funded training in those qualifications to participate, and they could opt in. It was purely voluntary. RTOs sent us their documentation. We provided that on to the validator. And RTOs were assured that everything would be confidential and there was no regulatory force to the findings. After that desktop research, the validator would interview employers if that was part of the model. And then the validator's findings would be discussed with the steering group as de-identified examples. So as I said, it was very confidential. The validator would say, RTO 1 is doing this, RTO 2 is doing that. The industry group didn't look at any actual RTO documents because obviously these carry the RTO branding, so it wouldn't have been possible to keep it confidential. And this was iterative. The group would meet a few times and the validator would say, well, so far I'm finding this. Do we need to change what we're doing or should we carry on? And the group together would develop recommendations to the RTOs. Then finally, like I said, the whole point of the exercise was to give feedback to the RTOs. So we implemented this 4 times. The first one was in aged care. We looked at 2 units of competency across 9 RTOs. And sorry, I should acknowledge this one was finished before I joined the project. That was a desktop validation supported with employer interviews, and that was conducted by RTO Assist. And we're lucky enough to have Marie Cleaver from RTO Assist in the audience here today. The second implementation was in training and assessment. That looked at 3 units of competency across 11 RTOs. And like I said, that was purely a desktop validation. That was conducted by Dr. Russell Docking, and unfortunately Russell can't join us here today. The third implementation was in automotive. This was actually, the 4th one to begin, but the 3rd one to finish. It looked at 3 units of competency across 5 RTOs. This one drew on the, as I said, it was the 4th one to be implemented. It drew on the lessons learnt from the previous ones and had a slightly different approach. The validator, David Love, who's kindly joined us here today, actually went out to the campuses and interviewed staff about the documentation. So this documentation was looked at in a collaborative process with the lecturers. Then there were also employee interviews. The 4th implementation was in bricklaying and blocklaying. 3 units of competency, 5 RTOs. That was a desktop validation. We intended to also have employer interviews and campus visits, but unfortunately we ran into some snags there, so we were able to just do employer interviews and a campus visit for 1 RTO as a kind of case study approach. That was again done by Dr. Russell Docking, who can't be here today. So what did the feedback to RTOs actually look like? So the validator looked for evidence of these quality features, things that we assumed all RTOs should be doing all the time in order to have valid assessment. So for example, assessment mapping is accurate and consistent, or valid methods are used to assess RPL, or online assessment is authenticated, that sort of thing. And obviously these are summary statements that summarise, say, a checklist of 5 or 10 detailed criteria. Where the validator found evidence of this quality feature, the RTO received a tick. Obviously, if there was no evidence, they got a cross. And then the findings were given back to RTOs in 2 ways, as quantitative data, so as Gutmann charts with ticks and crosses, and also as qualitative, constructive, descriptive kind of feedback. So the quantitative data looked like this. So as you can see, down the left side, all the features are listed, and across the top, all the RTOs. So you can see the RTOs are ranked. So RTO 6 should be very happy, they're all ticks. RTO 7 at the other end of the scale, not quite as many ticks. And also the features are ranked. So I should point out, we didn't apply any weighting. We're not saying that some of these features are more important than others or that they have more of an impact on validity. We're just saying how often they were observed. So for example, sufficient information provided to candidates, that was more commonly observed than consultation with industry. So where RTOs have exactly the same results, so the same ticks for the same things, they're just ordered numerically and they're put in the same column. RTO 2 is before RTO 8. But where RTOs have the same number of crosses but they're for different things, then they are ranked. So RTO4, as you can see, has a cross for something that generally more RTOs tended to get ticks for. So they are rated a little bit lower. So RTO4 is ranked a bit lower than RTO1, even though they both have 3 crosses. So what was the point of presenting the data this way? Well, it allows RTOs to get a more informed understanding of the findings. First of all, they can see the results against a clear benchmark. So those quality descriptors are defined elsewhere in the report. There's a justification about why you should be doing those things, how they affect validity. And RTOs can see, well, the validators said I didn't do this, therefore I got a cross there, I did do this, I've got a tick here. Also, RTOs can see their results compared to competitors, compared to the rest of the sector. And RTOs can see whether other people make those same mistakes, whether they get crosses for the same things. So for instance, that bottom row industry consultation, most RTOs did get a cross for that. It may be because that is a harder thing to get right, to do. It may be the validator was judging that one particularly harshly. There may have been a methodological flaw. There are lots of reasons why that one might be so common. And hopefully it allows RTOs to prioritise the areas they might work on when they're given this feedback. So for example, RTO4 might choose to pick off that one outlier, that cross that was highlighted red, because most other RTOs were showing that feature. They were one of the few RTOs not to do it. They might choose to work on that one first. So in addition to those charts, RTOs were given qualitative feedback. So where the features were observed, the validator said, I found evidence you're doing this, it's good. And this is why it's good. There was a judgment in each case for why we'd picked on this particular quality feature. And where a feature wasn't observed, the validator talked about that, said, well, I couldn't find evidence you're doing this, or you're doing this, but it's not quite hitting the mark. So an example there is authenticating online evidence. Sometimes there was no process to do that. Sometimes the RTO would ask students to sign a form saying, yes, I declare this is my own work. The validator pointed out, well, if the student's willing to cheat on an online assessment, they're probably willing to sign a false declaration too. So that may not be the best approach to authenticate online evidence. Then the validator would describe how this impacts validity. So in that case, obviously the risk is that the person being awarded the qualification isn't necessarily the person who demonstrated those competencies, if someone else has completed the assessment for that student, for instance. Then the validator would give suggested actions for improvement. So in that example, RTOs might authenticate the online evidence by doing spot checks of just a few of those competencies tested by another means through an interview or something like that, or getting a third party to validate that, yes, that person does have these competencies. So in addition to these individual reports to RTOs, we also prepared a report on each implementation, a sort of a summary one on each sector, just saying generally what most RTOs are doing. And these reports were given to the industry steering groups. These are the ones we will report to the Commonwealth as evidence that we've completed this project, and they will be made publicly available. And from these reports, some common themes that emerged, practices that reduce validity. Quite often the unit of competency wasn't used as the blueprint for assessment. So assessment was sort of task-based more than unit of competency-based. RTOs didn't have a process of going through the evidence that had been collected and then checking it back to the unit of competency to tick off, okay, well, this demonstrates this competency, this skill, this knowledge. And another common practice that reduces validity is that industry wasn't sufficiently consulted around assessment, both developing it in the first place and reviewing it with a view to improving it. Things that improve validity, the things that everyone got ticks for, students are well informed about assessment requirements. They know when they'll be assessed, why they're being asked to do a particular task, what good performance looks like, and that sort of thing. And RTOs have processes to allow for reasonable adjustment so that, for example, candidates with a disability can take a modified form of assessment, ensuring a level playing field for everybody, obviously. And RTOs showed evidence of detailed assessment planning, so clearly mapped out what resources will be required, when they'll be required, when the assessments will happen, what's being measured by each assessment, that sort of thing. So we have, just in the last couple of weeks, released all the reports, and we've talked to industry, to our steering group partners to get their feedback on the model, and we're in the process now of talking to RTOs to get their feedback. We haven't finished that, so these RTO findings are just indicative at this point. But some common themes emerging are, first of all, on the downside, there was a significant delay in getting the reports out, so apologies there to everyone, especially people in the aged care pilot. That was quite a delay, so sorry there. So because of that delay, it means that some of the findings are no longer relevant. RTOs have already changed what they're doing by the time they got the feedback. Also on the downside, in some cases, because of when we ran the pilot, some RTOs couldn't participate because they were too busy with other stuff at the time. And also on the downside, the field research, when we tried to interview employers, happened over a fairly brief period, so that limited the number of employers we could actually talk to. However, on the plus side, most RTOs have said that it was worth the wait. Even though they waited a long time, it's good to get that kind of constructive feedback. They didn't mind waiting. Another theme was the data. So as I said, this was mainly a desktop exercise, and it's been pointed out by the industry groups, by the RTOs, that documents don't necessarily give the whole picture of what goes on at the RTO. There may be fantastic processes that just aren't documented, or they're documented in a way that the validator couldn't really access. Or there might be a fantastic process that isn't followed necessarily to the letter each time. Also, we looked at 3 units of competency and asked for 2 complete samples of student evidence. It was pointed out that may not be a statistically valid sample of delivery in that qualification. On the plus side, the documents we asked RTOs to provide were exactly the same ones they had to have on hand anyway for audit purposes. So for many RTOs, it took maybe 30 minutes to sort of download the documents and click send and send them to us. So RTOs felt that there was really quite a low burden involved in this process. One of the industry groups suggested that, well, perhaps if we did this again, we could further reduce the burden by accessing the documents directly from the regulator. So that would obviously require an agreement with the regulator. Another theme is employers and industry. We found it very difficult to engage employers in this research. We approached every employer in the state who had a relationship with the RTOs that had participating in those qualifications, and we had a very low response rate. Even when employers did agree to participate, it was then quite hard to get hold of them to schedule an interview, to get them on the phone. Also, if we did focus on engaging more employers, phoning them up, getting them involved, going out to do face-to-face interviews with them, that would probably blow out the cost of this model quite significantly. But on the plus side, RTOs and industry were very supportive of the fact that this was really industry-driven, that industry were the ones defining those quality criteria we were looking at. And also RTOs felt that this was a really comprehensive industry validation of what they were doing. And industry groups were quite happy about the insight this gave them into RTO practices. They rarely get that level of detailed insight into what RTOs are doing. So, as I said, the end product of all this was a report to each RTO from a validator and the industry representative saying, this is what you're doing, this is great. You're not doing these things perhaps because you should, and this is how you might do it. The downside with that some RTOs have pointed out was that even though we had a panel of industry experts, there was most often just one training and assessment expert. So the harshness or leniency of the feedback might depend on which validator you got for your pilot. On the plus side, people really liked the educative focus. Industry and RTOs appreciated the fact that the point of the exercise was to help improvement, and the feedback was very constructive and positive. The benchmarking against a common standard was seen as very valuable. That benchmark is really transparent and well defined. People liked that. The confidentiality was seen as a real bonus, that often RTOs will have their own arrangement for validation and moderation with another RTO, possibly 2 other RTOs, but there's a bit of risk there because you are essentially sharing your assessment products with a competitor when you do that. So there's a bit of risk. But in this process, it was so confidential that RTOs could safely share their materials. Also, for regional RTOs, it was pointed out that sometimes the RTO you have a relationship with, the staff would know each other. So the staff are essentially critiquing their friend's work or being critiqued by a friend. So this approach was seen as much more non-threatening because it was so confidential. And finally, the large sample of RTOs was seen as really good. RTOs could see their performance against a huge sample of the sector. And the feedback, as I said, was seen as very comprehensive and structured in a way that the RTOs can actually take action on it. So that's it for me. The next section of this workshop is intended to be a panel discussion. What we'd really like to do is get some feedback from you, some thoughts about the pilot model. We have some key questions here. This will be part of our evaluation of the model, which again will feed back to the Commonwealth to sort of inform the way forward. Just before we move on to there though, I'd just like to say on your table, you have some sheets of paper. The questions are on here. You can also access them online. There's a link there. There's a QR code if you've got a scanner. If you have any further questions or comments about this, please email my colleague Karen Purdy. Her email address is also on the paper in front of you, simply because I'm moving on after this, so I won't be able to reply to your emails. And after this session, we're doing that, so please hang around. So these are the questions, and this part of the process will be facilitated by Keith Spence. And I propose we spend maybe the first 5 minutes or so just with a general question and answer about the material I've just presented, if anyone wants to clarify anything. And then we'll have roving mics to talk about these discussion points. So thank you. Over to you, Keith.
Why don't we just start off with some general questions around the presentation, if anyone's got any questions or clarification, or we can move straight into the questions we've got on the board. Anyone want to make a comment about the presentation at all? No? All right, yeah.
Thanks. Presentation's great. I'm not overly familiar with the model. Is something going to come out to general RTOs about what the model found? And I suppose when you look at some of the, the validation processes, what gave you a tick? Industry engagement is a tick, but what did you need to demonstrate for that to be a tick? And is that going to come out of this particular study as well?
Probably the gentleman next to you might be able to answer that. The first one.
Well, it's my page just to introduce yourself.
Jeff Jones, HDA.
Good afternoon, David Love. I was one of the validators, and my project was the automotive industry. In terms of what would constitute valid industry engagement, we took the view that it wasn't a single employer. So it's not just to talk to one employer about one assessment practice. It's to look more broadly than that. It may be a number of employers in a similar industry sector employing people with a similar kind of qualification, industry associations, union bodies, and as such. It's not just about the single employer. Single employer you build a relationship with, you may get good rapport, poor rapport, but it's not going to give you industry input. So we took the view on this instance that we tried to gauge industry engagement by the number of employers that were consulted as part of the RTO's assessment processes, and then to look beyond that. So when an RTO was presenting, here's my validation evidence, and it was one employer with one signature, some questions have to be asked, raises questions about the validity of that evidence when you're applying it to a much broader cohort than just one student. Okay. Thank you.
Sorry. Back there we have a question.
This is actually a question from our webinar participant, Sam Smith from the Pilbara. It took 12 months, which means the assessment have already been through other validation and moderation changes. She'd like to know why it took so long.
I don't know where to go with that. My apologies for the delay that was there. We kicked this off, it was a bit of an exploration. You can imagine the initial reaction from the department is there a risk with this? Are we overreaching? Is there always you're worried about what, there's problems there may be in terms of the findings. And also what we learnt is as we go, we're getting improvements with each consultation, with each pilot validation that was done, the feedback we're getting from Russell Docking, from David. They're helping us learn each time about improvements. So, and that got reflected in the final reports of all of the validations, even though one had been done some time earlier. We're able to go back and just sort of polish and nuance some of the text in there, and so I think it was worth the wait. In normal circumstances, you know, these things should be more immediate. The validation's done, that feedback should be much quicker. It was a pilot, it is sort of research based, so I guess, you know, mea culpa, you can probably put most of the blame of that onto me.
I think it's right. Certainly from the panel's perspective, we did mess around a little bit at the very beginning, trying to frame this thing up the right way, taking our time, thinking about how to design it, all that sort of stuff. So, I mean, that all takes time, but there's a model now that's sort of been established, it's been improved. I think that model, if you wanted to try, you know, you could roll out and do it quite quickly now, but it's been established, that's the difference. It's just, we wanted the conclusions from this to be valid, we wanted a model that was repeatable, all that sort of stuff. So you just take your time to design it, I think, and so trying to do this quickly wasn't the objective of this. Trying to get a model that was actually something that we could repeat and use again and again was the objective, and taking a bit of time to get that right, I think, is more important.
Well, someone asked about whether the reports will be released. There are individual reports, of course, tailored to each provider, and it gives them comparisons between them and other providers, all anonymous. That's not going to be released. But there are 4 summary reports, and my understanding is that we've got, I'd have to have a look at the approvals, but that'll be going onto a public website. My recollection is we've provided it back to the Commonwealth now as our national reporting, and they put all that evidence onto a Commonwealth site. So sooner rather than later, you will see these available. We would generally put these onto the Vet InfoNet section of the department's website. So when that happens, we'll have a list of stakeholders, hopefully from this meeting as well, and we'll keep you posted.
So look, we've got a bunch of questions up here. The first one's really about the sort of strengths and weaknesses of the model. What do people generally feel about that? I mean, for me, I thought one of the real strengths of this was that it's kind of like a friendly audit in a sense, and it's actually not so much an audit that sort of says, do you have the tools? The strength of this was, you have the tools, are you using them, and how well are you using them? So I thought that combined with the confidentiality aspect that sort of said you get some feedback about how well you're applying these tools in your business. It's kind of really powerful. I don't know, what do others think about that? I mean, Dave, you
Just a comment.
yeah.
Good afternoon. I see that one of the strengths is that it's got the potential to improve industry practices via a consistent, proactive approach.
Can I have a go? Ian Andrews, I was involved in two of the projects, the aged care and the TAE. My general question in terms of its usefulness, is whether there's now going to be a post hoc, investigation of, well, what does this mean in terms of the initial audit that was presumably okay, and without giving any pressure on the RTOs, do we have some way of bringing the two systems together? And I know that probably won't be the case, but I think there is it is interesting in terms of what the starting point was extreme, as far as we're concerned, extreme concerns about ongoing quality of delivery, despite the recent, in both cases, strategic audits that have been undertaken of aged care and before that of TAE. And yet we were still concerned about some of the quality of delivery. Now, and that was our initial reason for putting our hands up to be involved in this process. So it's, what impact this has on that general concern about low quality delivery.
Yeah, I'd be really worried personally if this started to kind of blur into kind of what TAC do as well. The whole strength of this is it's separate. It's in a non-threatening environment. It actually provides feedback in a kind of constructive way to an RTO that says, look, here's best practice, you're all here, you can make these sort of improvements. You've got some real strengths in this area. I mean, it's actually about how you use the tools, not do you have the tools, which is kind of what the audit is about, I think. So I see them as two separate
It's an
kind of functions.
distinction, though, Keith, sorry, with respect, because David is an auditor, was an auditor, and I'm training counsel. Russell has been an auditor since I was a teenager, and so on. So and we've got the same dilemma. We've got TAC auditors are also ASPA auditors. So we've got confusion within the system about who's driving what in terms of quality.
But to me, it's not what the auditor is actually being asked when they're doing it. They're being asked a different suite of questions when they're being asked to do the sort of accreditation audit to what we're actually asking in this thing.
Well, if I could say, one's about what's sufficient, the other's about what's desirable. And how, as a community of practice, how do you talk with each other, talk with your stakeholders to make it better? And then ultimately, I think, and this is the important bit about not over-regulating, is how do you learn from that? How do you brand it? How do you sell that? How do you add value for your consumers, whether that's the employer or the student? But when we were first tasked with this, just for those who aren't aware, under the National Partnership, what was driving it was about comparing all the pilot models done across all states. We're not the only state who had to do it, and going, can we get a single model to put into the standards? And we sort of pushed back on that. So did other states, by the way. You don't need another standard around this. This is, I think, more about a cultural change and, like I said, a community of practice to improve. And I think that's much more desirable than regulating it.
If I could make a brief comment on that, I would agree with those comments. I think broadly, from an RTO with a large number of qualifications on scope, what you're predominantly interested in is where might there be systemic strengths and where might there be systemic weaknesses, so that you can change cultural approaches to broad potential issues that might exist across your suite of qualifications. Yes, there is some low-level benefit in a particular qualification, be it whichever one it was, that suggested that you had to do some work around a particular area. But the great strength was potentially suggesting that that was a weakness across your entire activities of an institution or an RTO. And that's where it is very definitely focusing on it has a different outcome, a different focus, as opposed to a regulatory black-white. This is much more strongly focused on the educative process, which you don't typically get from an audit process. You occasionally do in the audit process. The auditor occasionally does give you some advice, but they're very loath to do that, and we all understand why. But from my perspective, very unhelpful. If they say you're non-compliant but don't tell you how to go from there to where you need to be, whereas this process is more about this is where you're at, these are the things you might like to consider to lift yourself from here to here. So I would see it as very different in terms of what it's trying to achieve.
Derek, my understanding of ASCO is that they've been funded 48 million to now provide that consultative feedback to RTO to help them meet compliance. So that will change across the system as well.
Well, I think we all hope so. And that's a very new initiative, isn't it? Yeah. So up until the last budget, when those announcements were made, the auditors have held the line. We're here to audit, to make a judgment, not to provide advice. And if you look at the paperwork that comes out from TAC, they specifically state, because I've audited you, I am not able to provide advice as to how you might achieve compliance if you're found to be non-compliant. It's a very different process to this one.
Okay, thanks. We've got another question online, I think.
Yes, thank you. Mandy has asked, and has circled back to a comment that you made earlier. It was an interesting comment about the insufficient industry involvement in the development and review of assessment, etc. If they're not going to be involved, and this is appreciated as they have businesses to run, surely the RTO should not be penalised as per the new standards. Would you like me to repeat the question?
Yeah, if you could, please.
Absolutely. It's interesting comment about the insufficient industry involvement in the development and review of the assessments. If they're not going to be involved, so if industry are not going to be involved, and this is appreciated as they have businesses to run, surely the RTO should not be penalised as per the new standards.
Okay, thanks for that. A really interesting question and really timely question. And I will pass over to David Love, but just make a very general comment. Is we brought in all the industry players we could to drive this, not specifically employers, but certainly industry players, and also Larry has some comments to make on this. But one of the challenges in all of this is getting employers, for the reasons your question is driving at, is that they are busy people. But it is very difficult to get employers to come into the tent on this, but boy, was every attempt made. But with that, I'll just throw it to Larry and then on to David to add their comments as well.
Yeah, I think the industry involvement is a difficulty, as one that the system has struggled with. It's really important to have industry driving the agenda and setting the parameters and getting involved as much as possible. But it is really, really hard work to do it. And partly because, as the questioner said, people are busy. Particularly small business is very busy making a dollar and keeping the door open rather than sitting around talking about esoteric issues around training. And we just have to get over that, I think, and take what industry input we can get, and also look at where industry puts their hand up and says, we'll pay for that. When industry pays, you're very clear what they want. There's no black and white then, but they're not always in that position, and it's not always, that's not consistent across the system. And certainly in the area that I deal in, where 60% of all vet activity is fee for service, it's those parts where the industry is paying, the employers are paying, that you know very clearly what's required. So it's not going to be easy, but it's really important never to slip back to the place where industry doesn't have an input, and that internationally that's what we're seen as being above almost any other country.
All right, just back to the industry engagement. Appreciate small RTOs working with small business. It can be quite difficult to get that level of industry engagement that you might want to aspire to make your assessments valid. But it's to think broader than just that one employer. Industry is a much broader definition than the single employer. And we have industry training councils, you've got industry skills councils nationally, we've got the CCI, we've got the industry associations. There's no end of other avenues that we as industry people can seek to engage with to get that level of advice. And I'd encourage you, as those of you from RTOs, to think more broadly about where you might get that advice and who to consult. And I won't preach to you about, this is right or wrong, but it is broader than just one employer. As to, I can pick up on Keith's point here about audit, not audit. I am an auditor of RTOs, and you RTO people out there in the audience here, you find it very stressful. Tell you what, so do I. So this was, for the most part, a very enjoyable project to be part of. It allowed for a different level of dialogue, for a different level of interaction with the RTOs than I would have otherwise obtained. It opened up a means for collaboration and for advice, and I learned as much as I believe the people I spoke with learned from the process. So in this, whoever your validator might be, the independent validator that it might be, take it that you want them to be able to add value to the process, that they would seek to be assisting you get better quality processes around assessment, and that it's not just about, as I said, the black and white, compliant, non-compliant. This is really about quality improvement, about making your systems better. Okay.
I was just interested in asking a question about the model. Will it actually be brave enough to address validation of RPL as it applies in some industry sectors? Because I suppose from my point of view, RPL is a hoary chestnut that has never been cracked.
Yes, RPL was one of the features we looked at. It wasn't in that example data set I put up there, sorry. But it was certainly assessed, particularly in the bricklaying and blocklaying pilot and the automotive pilot. Yep.
Can you hear me without me? It was unfortunate the way this project ran through. It was for the RTO to identify those students. So they picked the student files. And if that student file didn't happen to have RPL, then we didn't look at RPL per se for that exercise. We validated their RPL processes, but not necessarily the outcomes of that in looking at the documentation that they might have used for making the judgments. So it just happened to be, flick of the coin, did we happen to pick one or not in this instance? But on a broader validation exercise, one of your risk factors as an RTO might be RPL assessments. And then you'd look to more honing in on those judgments you make around RPL via RPL assessment.
I would hope there would be an RPL practice.
Okay, look, one of the questions for me that came out of the whole the pilot process was we identified a really good tool, I think, and what we saw through it was that there's value for the individual RTO in the kind of feedback, but there was a lot of value in looking across the sort of the cross-section of RTOs and looking at some sort of systematic sort of things that sort of where we could really be perhaps educating more effectively and sort of I guess for the whole panel we kind of felt that there's a tool here that could be used much more broadly around the system. In targeting some of the areas we targeted, for example, TAE, we saw that as quite strategic, an investment in sort of trying to improve the quality of TAE. It's got a long-term payback, but if we've got to really lift the kind of quality of TAE and assessments that go with it. So the question we have around could it be adopted as a standard approach, I think is a really important one. I mean, something that can build confidence in the quality of assessment, where industry, through their engagement in these steering groups that would sit across these things, would build confidence in the quality of assessment. I think it could be quite a powerful tool. We've heard it's not burdensome. It's actually quite, a light touch. It's a positive sort of thing for the RTOs that experience, I think, from what we've heard. So I'm interested for people, your views on how you feel that this might be applied in a more general sense across the system, and perhaps even from the RTOs that maybe have experienced this already, their view would be quite interesting on this as well. So is anyone prepared to offer a view on that? Do you think it would add a whole lot of burden? Would it improve? Yeah.
I'm not one of the RTOs who were involved, but I'd certainly like to see the outcome. I think it would be a real benefit to sort of have a look at our own systems in relation to the benchmarks that might have been set from this particular process. I mean, I'd certainly welcome the opportunity to see something as a general principle for improvement.
Sounds like a cheap plug, but I've just given a session in the room over there talking about setting up an industry validation network, which addresses a number of the issues that Stephanie's referred to and David's referred to, could address. And it would be not too dissimilar to the old CAG system, which was very good at providing that cross-industry validation, cross-RTO validation. So I'm hoping that'll be on the cards in the next couple of months.
Well, do you envisage that being something, though, run completely independent of a new standard or an additional standard or a modification of the standards, or something that's completely run by industry, when I say industry, RTOs and employers and industry stakeholders, independent of doing anything else to the standards?
Well, as David says, practically anything goes. I mean, you've got a list as long as your arm that constitutes industry engagement. We're offering industry engagement from a training council perspective. We are a conduit to industry. That's what we're funded to do. We encourage employers. Often we get RTOs as well. But we'll be looking at industry in terms of employers being involved, and we'll have ratios, we'll have confidentiality agreements, and so on, to get direct feedback from employers about the nature of the assessment for that particular unit.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a really important question. I encourage you all to feed back to us on that particular issue, because the Commonwealth will be looking to us to give some kind of guidance in our evaluation reports back to the Commonwealth as part of this pilot, and to give them that recommendation. And what I'm hearing is that you wouldn't want to beef up the standards. This is something different.
Yeah, Ross, I think we've already got about 130 pages of standards at the moment, so I'd really appreciate not adding another one to the system if you could.
That is the approach we've taken, by the way, as much as possible. That's where we don't want to go.
Kathy Adams, I'm just a lecturer at CY O'Connor. My question, going back to industry engagement, like we all know it's quite difficult to pin people down. A thought that came to me, and I don't know if it's relevant or not, is would it, and I don't know who would organise it, but having some sort of networking system of industries that have put their hand up to say, hey, yes, we will validate your tools. So if RTOs or particular areas are having difficulty finding industry in their location, then they have somewhere to go to, a go-to person that has already said, look, don't worry about approaching me, I'm more than happy to help you. But, you know, perhaps somewhere along the lane, some sort of audit or spreadsheet could be pulled up for every qualification if you got to the point where you just didn't have anybody that you could go to, especially country RTOs that are really quite small and have, you know, a smaller set of industries to go to.
Well, just in response to that, I think the involvement we've had of our training councils in this process has been exemplary, and that they are probably a really good touch point around, and they know what training packages they're most keenly involved with and qualifications, generally aware of the issues that relate to them. But I think they are, that would be my first port of call. I think they would be fantastic in that particular arrangement.
I think your point about how skinny things can get in the regions is a really valid one as well, and sort of developing up some sort of network there could be quite a useful thing to do, I suspect.
Having run an RTO in the wheat belt, I know how competitive everybody is about not wanting to share their industry contacts. They're treated like gold. So I think it's breaking down that attitude to say, well, this is going to be good for all of us, basically. And I think that's really important to get through that mindset that this is not about us versus them. This is about the good of the students and for the good of the training industry in general.
Other questions?
I was just going to make a comment about the group validation idea that Ian raised, and I have been to those before. People have a real issue about being identified as the person presenting their own material, and it's really important that it's completely anonymous and all the branding's removed, and so it takes somebody to organise all that, collect all the material, remove all the branding, and run the whole process. And what we've learned is people don't want to pay for it. So it is going to be up to the industry councils and people like that to do it, because it's a necessary evil that people won't pay for.
We have a slight technical problem with because we want to preserve confidentiality and copyright, and that'd be hard to do if there's no branding on it. So maybe we'll have to have a training council approach to, you know, how could we prove that somebody had nicked something?
You'll never do that anyway. You mean prove that
Well,
somebody bought an assessment tool to a validation and somebody else
Yeah.
then adopted it?
Yeah, so the guarantee is to the RTO, well, we're protecting your intellectual property, your confidentiality. Everybody's agreeing with that. We used to do that in the old CAG system, that people would hand stuff in at the end of the session. We've got the problem of sending stuff out regionally, but if there's no branding on it, that would...
Oh, well, people would be allowed to take it.
No.
We've probably got time for a couple more questions, if there are any. Come on, how about from someone who hasn't actually asked a question? It's been a bit quiet up there in that kind of back corner up there, I suspect. I'm going to start pointing fingers in a minute. Surely if someone's got a thought in there about this.
We'll take comments as well.
Yeah, not abuse, but comments would be... So come on, any other thoughts? This is, I mean, it's a really big issue for industry. Every time we visit an employer, this quality of assessment, they want it to be something that's bankable, that when this person here and this person here front up and they both come from different institutes, that you can kind of bank the assessment as if they've gone through and they're assessed as competent. I can take that as a kind of sort of a tick. Same way as if someone's got a university degree, it's a tick. You know, and that's what we need in this. And at the moment, there is that variability there, and we really, there are tools that we're trying to encourage here that can make a real difference, I think. So, comment?
Well, just going on from that, I mean, one of the things when I've asked about that is if you actually had tools that have been validated somewhere else and you purchase them, I've been told, well, then you have to validate them again. So that's my comment on that, and I think, well, that negates that ability. I come from an RTO. We were involved in two of the projects there. One of the very good things was the confidentiality, that we were able to send things off, and that benchmarking then against the other RTOs was really important for us. For where are you going from here? Because it did take a long time, and it actually took a lot of effort to get material ready to send off. And I sort of said, well, you've done 4. We have 260 qualifications on scope. Where are you going with it?
Yeah, I think firstly your point about we've only done 4 and it took a long time. I was very conscious that we were only ever going to do kind of 4, and we did take our time. This wasn't kind of focused, I guess, as much on the client as actually learning, if you like, how the process was going to work and how the tool worked. Yeah, I think if we now said we have a tool that kind of works, you could be a lot more kind of focused about it and do more. The question then is, do you really want to do 200 and whatever it is? I think it is going to be a risk-based approach where you, based on perhaps feedback from industry, employers that sort of says, look, here's an area where we're concerned about consistency of where you might actually come in and sort of use these sort of tools to actually help improve the consistency in that particular area. Is it a tool you'd use kind of blanket everywhere? No, because it's a burden. So I think it's the sort of thing you could use to sort of help target particular areas. Well, that's certainly the way I'd be thinking of using it. Others?
Some brave soul said, all right, at the end of this, we're going to give you a tip for that unit or that qualification as meeting industry requirements for the delivery of that qualification.
Could I just comment that I've been very surprised at just how hungry RTOs are for feedback. They really like it. If it's feedback that they trust, they really do value it. I sit on the board of NEAS, which was the pseudo-English language regulator until ASQA and TEXA took over those roles, and we thought we'd be out of business. But because we created a quality assurance process that was based on internal surveys, it was really quite surprising how many people have gone, yep, we're happy to pay for that sort of service. And a couple of the big public RTOs in this state have been quite happy to pay for that service too, just to get that feedback from students, from staff, and compare them all and see what sort of information they got out of that. So I think it's encouraging that people are sort of putting their hand up and saying, no, we really want to improve, we want the feedback, and in our case, in the NEAS case, they're prepared to pay for it.
Okay, we've got, now we're getting questions. Getting a bit late, isn't it? All right, yep.
Hi, I think it was similar to what the gentleman was saying about getting the TINC. Is there, say, something that the RTOs could work towards to say, we have best practice, we've been assessed on this, and this is what we're getting out of it as a marketing viewpoint for their students to come to, or that sort of thing?
Well, it's an interesting idea. I mean, if you've got an industry sort of steering group that would actually say the people that have been through this have kind of been assessed, and we're actually endorsing their assessment as sort of up to industry spec, it's the sort of thing that could be, I would imagine, would be quite powerful for industry.
So some of your industry associations might be in a really
It's
good
kind of what
place
you're talking
to do
about.
it
Yeah, good suggestion. We've got one more online question, I think, and then we've got to wrap up. Is that right, or we... Oh, sorry, you got a mic there? Sorry. Yep.
It's a very quick question from Sam, and up in Pilbara again. She just would like to know, will this be an ongoing project in the future?
Yes, I'd like to know that too. Ross?
Okay. A couple of things as part of the wrap-up. I'd really like to thank... there are a few people I want to thank to finish this off, but that's an open question. If you're asking, have we got an appetite in the department with a lot of money, government money at the moment, to put towards this? Short answer is no, it's not our intention. We need to see what pops back out of the national process and see where we go. Personally, and again, this is not a departmental view, it's a personal view, I think there's something about what we contract publicly that where this would have a value as, and again, this very personal view, is about making sure that in the public interest with the funds we put out there, there is a way of guaranteeing the quality of the product, and I think this would be a good way over and above what's standard audit. But again, very qualified comment. So the short answer is not yet, or no. We're not intending to move that way, but we're very interested in the sorts of processes from industry players as to how you might adopt it in the short term. Just very briefly, people that this thing turned on the efforts of some of my staff, Karen Purdy and Stephanie. They did some great work working with the validators to help them work on the reports and sharpen them up. This would have made no sense as a project if we didn't have the industry buy-in, the training councils, and Keith as the head of the State Training Board at the time, and of course our industry reps, or RTO reps, such as ACPET through Larry Davies and Derek for TDA have been fantastic, but the Training Council support and help, and that of having industry experts like David Love, Russell Docking and Marie Cleaver have been so helpful. So thank you to everyone who was involved, and I really look forward to the feedback from the experts, which are the RTOs. Thank you.
Authorised by the Government of Western Australia, Perth.